Last week, we began a study of a journey through the Bible, and we want to continue that study this morning. We've left off looking at the journey through the Bible in Joseph in Egypt. Joseph is the second youngest son of Abraham, and he ends up in Egypt because he's sold there into slavery by his brothers, and because of their envying him, because he had the ability to see visions and understand dreams, and so they sold him into slavery. And over a period of time, he's put into prison because of a false charge of committing adultery with a man's wife, which he did not do. And then he was elevated to a second up position in the nation of Egypt in order that he might protect their lives by the vision that he correctly interpreted of the 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty. And then the storehouses of Egypt were built, and all nations came to Egypt to buy grain, and that would bring his family there. And eventually he would bring Israel, his father, and his brethren into Egypt, and they would live in the land of Goshen. Now, in chapter number 50, Israel has died, Joseph is dying, and this is at the end of the book of Genesis. And now the brothers believe that he'll try to get even for the evil that they had done to him now that their father had died. But in Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 25 and 26, then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Notice that he knew that the people of God would not stay in Egypt. He knew that they would come out. And he told them when they came out at a later date to take his bones and take them out with them so he would be buried in the homeland of his people and not left back in Egypt. And they take the oath and they promise to do that. That leads us to the next Bible period, and that's Moses. Moses is the man that is called to bring God's people out of Egyptian bondage. And that story is told in the book of Exodus. We are introduced to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. And when God appears to him in the burning bush, he tells him in verse 7, and the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Come now, therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And so, he's going to bring them out of Egypt. And he does that over a period of time, beginning in Exodus chapter 5, when he goes before Pharaoh. He explains that God's desire is for Pharaoh to let his people go, and of course, Moses was told that he was not going to do that, and so God brought 10 plagues upon the nation of Egypt. And one by one, he was demonstrating his power to Pharaoh and to the other nations, and also demonstrating it to the people who were in bondage. And beginning with the fourth plague, he makes a distinction that the plague does not affect the people in Goshen, but only those in Egypt. And then he would finally relent at the death of the firstborn in Exodus chapter number 12. We also see in Exodus 10 a very important matter, that the Passover was instituted in order to preserve life of the firstborn of the Israelite people by putting the blood on the lintel post after killing the lamb. They would be allowed, when the angel of death came through the nation of Egypt, that their children would be saved. And indeed, after the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh relents and lets the people go. That brings us to the Red Sea in Exodus chapter number 14. In Exodus 13 and 18, so God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. Now they're leaving Egypt, they've plundered the people, they're free people, and now they're heading to the land of promise. And when he had made an end of speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. Now, what we see in the Red Sea is that God miraculously, by the hand of Moses, caused a wind to blow all night and divided the waters of the Red Sea on the left and on the right, and made dry ground in the middle, and the children of Israel walked across the Red Sea to go to the other side. And when they were on the other side, the Egyptians pursued them and went into the midst of the Red Sea. And as soon as they did, God brought the waters back again after his people had crossed, and the Egyptians were destroyed, and they could see their bodies on the seashore on the other side. And they stood on the other side of the Red Sea, a free people. Now they were the nation that God had promised Abraham back in Genesis chapter number 12. Now they are a free people, and they are a nation. And when we get to Mount Sinai, that is where God gives them the law. He gives them the law, the Ten Commandments and the law that would regulate them, guide them, instruct them in the ways of God and what God would demand of them as they were his people. And so this began the nation of Israel. And so the nation of Israel begins at that particular time, and they're on their way to the promised land. But after a period of 3 months, they're on the borders of Canaan. And prior to going in, God, through the hand of Moses, sent spies into the land. And these spies came in, and they came out with 2 different reports. 10 spies said, yes, we've seen the land. It's full of milk and honey, and all the things that God said about it are there, except there's giants in the land. Excuse me, there's great walled cities. They got great armies, and there's giants in the land. And if we go in and try to subdue it, then we will be crushed. And so they did not believe God. And they began to cry all night, and they were going to choose new leaders and go back to Egypt. But 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, they said that they could take the land, and that they were able, that they should not test God, but that they should go in because the people were fearful of them because of what God had done to Egypt. And yet, God had had enough. In Numbers, chapter number 14, beginning in verse 33, and you and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and bear the brunt of the infidelity until your carcasses are consumed in the wilderness. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. And so, for a number of 40 years, they would wander in the wilderness. And while they wandered in the wilderness, the first generation that came out of Egypt, 603,550, all of them died in the wilderness in that 40-year period, except Joshua and Caleb, the faithful spies. And so God has kept his word. He has punished them for 40 years, and now the wilderness wandering is over. And now they're again at the borders of Canaan. And now Moses is died, and now Joshua is going to lead them into the promised land. In Joshua 1 verse 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, and what he told him was that he would be with him, just like God was with Moses. He would lead them and would guide them, and they would inherit the land that God had promised them. And so the book of Joshua is referred to as the book of conquest. And during the time of the book of Joshua, they take the land of Canaan. And then after the land is taken, they divide up the land by tribe, and each tribe gets their inheritance. Now, Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh had asked for their inheritance on the other side of the Jordan River because it was more fertile for their cattle and for their sheep. And so God granted that after the battle had been fought, and after the land had been subdued for their brethren, then they could go back over the Red Sea, and they would be able to take their possession, and the rest of the Israelite nation would get their inheritance in the land of Canaan. And so, as we draw near to the book of Joshua's ending, God has completed promise number 2. The nation is now free, and now they have a home. And so both those promises have been kept, and now they have a home, and that home is in the land of Canaan. And then Joshua, before his death, he challenges them. And he says in Joshua 24 and verse 15, he says, "And if it seem evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And so he challenged them. He challenged them to determine who they were going to serve. Were they going to serve God, follow his law and the covenant that they had bound themselves to, or were they going to follow the gods in the land in which they dwell? Joshua said, we've made our choice. We're going to serve the Lord, me and my house. And if you read in the next verse, they promised to serve the Lord and do all that he commanded them to do. Well, that's what they said. Well, is that what they did? Did they remain faithful to God? Well, that leads us to the next period of time, and that's the book of Judges. And what we see in Judges is that there grows a generation that knew not God. And they knew not God because they had not been taught by their fathers of the great things that God had done for the Jews. They had not taught them about the great deliverance in Egypt and how the land was taken, how it was given to them as an inheritance. And they didn't teach those stories. And so this brought in a period of spiritual ignorance. And so they forgot about God. And they began to go into spiritual idolatry. And in Judges 2:18, "And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved by the pity, by their groaning, because of those who oppressed them and harassed them." So this begins a period called the Judges. It begins with a man named Othniel, who is the first judge, and it will last to the last judge, Samuel. And these 15 judges would rule over the Israelites. But it was a very tumultuous time, because what they would do is that they would cry because they were being oppressed. God would hear their cry. He would pity them. He would send in a deliverer in the form of a judge, and then that judge would deliver them, and then that judge would live his life, and then he would die, and as soon as he died, they would go back to their evil. They'd be oppressed again. They'd cry to God. God sent another deliverer. You get the picture. This went on for a period of about 350 years. And so they were led and directed by God through the judges. But then, after the period of judges ends, they determined that they want a different type of system. They want to have the system of the United Kingdom. They decided in 1 Samuel chapter 8 that they want to have a king like all the nations around them. They want to be like everybody else. And Samuel's sons did not walk in his ways, so they didn't want his sons being judges over them. And so now they wanted a king. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, this displeased Samuel, and God says, don't get angry at them. They haven't rejected you, they rejected me. But before you give them a king, you tell them what the king will do. And so he explained to them in verses 8 through about verse 18 of all the evil the king would bring upon them and their families. And yet in verse 19 they say, nevertheless, we want a king. And so God was going to give them a king. And the first king that would be in the United Kingdom would be called Saul. And when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, there is a man of whom I spoke to you, this one shall reign over my people. And so Saul was chosen as the first king over the nation of Israel. Now, Saul began very well, but he finished very terribly. He had a problem. He did not follow God's instructions. As one example, when he told him to go into the Amalekites and destroy everything that drew the breath of life in 1 Samuel 15, he refused to do that. He kept the king alive. He kept the best of the sheep and oxen. And then when he was chastised by Samuel for not following the instructions of God, he said that the people kept them in order to offer sacrifice to God. And it was at that time in 1 Samuel 15 that God rejected Saul. And Samuel told Saul that God has rejected you as being king, and he's going to take the kingdom away from you and give it to one after his own heart. And so he would reign for a period of 40 years, and then he would die in battle with his sons, and then that would bring to prominence the man David. David would be the next king over Israel. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah, which was his home. But David became the next king. Now for 7 years he reigned over just Judah and Hebron, and then later on all of Israel would become under his command, and he would reign in Israel for 40 years. And so he became a king that the Bible refers to as the man after God's own heart. He becomes the best king that they had. But that doesn't mean he didn't have problems. He had problems too. He committed adultery, and it has eventually led to murder in the situation with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite, her husband. And because of that, God punished David in that the blood would never be far from his house. And indeed that happened. One of his sons was killed because after he raped his sister, and then 2 years later, the full brother of Tamar, Absalom, he would kill Amnon. He would kill him, and David really didn't do anything. And then Absalom would even try to steal the kingdom away from his father, and yet he would have to be subdued. And then there were bloodshed during the years of David's reign. And so the last years of David's reign were very turbulent. But yet he remained faithful to God, and then he would hand the kingdom over to his son, and his son would be Solomon. In 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 53, so King Solomon sent them, brought him down from the altar, and he came and fell down before the king, before King Solomon, and Solomon said to him, go to your house. So Solomon now is the next king over the United Kingdom. And early in his reign, God appeared to him in a vision, in a dream, and said that he would give him anything that he wanted. And so what he asked for wisdom. He asked for wisdom so he could guide, and he would know the difference between right and wrong, and he could lead God's people in the way that was right and proper. God was so pleased with what Solomon asked for that he gave him the other things that he didn't ask for. He gave him a lot of wealth, made him a very powerful king, also made him very prosperous, and also made him excel in wisdom more than any man before him and any man after him. And he would have been greatly blessed had he continued to follow God. But sadly, the people that profited from his wisdom were others, but Solomon never used the wisdom himself. And he would marry 700 wives, have 300 concubines, and those wives, many of them marriage for political alliances, many of them would practice idolatry, would worship pagan gods, and he would build altars to their gods in the land of Israel, and then even he would begin to go to worship with them in the house of their gods. And of course this was spiritual adultery. And so God determined at the end of Solomon's life, just before his life went in, that the kingdom would be taken away and that it would be rent from him, and that the kingdom would divide. 10 tribes would go, and there would be another 2, and the other 2 would be, because of his promise to David, that there would always be a remnant. And so in the days of Solomon, he was promised that God said, I won't do it in your days, but after you go die, and you lay to rest with your people, then I'm going to divide the kingdom and take it out of your hands. And so that indeed what will happen. And so Saul, David, and Solomon are the kings of the United Kingdom. They each serve for a period of 40 years. At the end of that 120 years, in 1 Kings chapter 12, we see that the kingdom divides. In 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 17, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel, who dwelt in the cities of Judah, and he would have the southern kingdom. Here's what happened. Jeroboam and Rehoboam was Solomon's son, and he would be the rightful heir to the throne, but the kingdom divided because the people of God came to Rehoboam, and he asked him, what should I do? And they said, you need to lessen our burden. You need to lessen our tax. Your father has put heavy burdens on us, and it made it very difficult for us to serve him. If you will lighten the load and lighten the burden that we have, then the people here will follow you. He said, well, that was good advice. Go, in 3 days I'll give you my answer. And then he went and asked his own peer group, what should I do? And they encouraged him to get more difficult, to be tougher than his father, and to really make their burden even more difficult. And so when they came back, he said that he was going to make their burden even more difficult, took the advice of the younger set, and when he did, they revolted. And so Jeroboam, who was a military leader, he took 10 tribes, and these would become the tribe of the northern kingdom, which we would call Israel. And then the other two, as we read, would belong to Rehoboam, and he would dwell in Jerusalem, and he would have Judah and Benjamin. And so the tribes divided, and there are 2 in the north called Israel, and 2 in the south called the southern kingdom and called Judah. And now the nation of God that was united under Saul, David, and Solomon are now divided under Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So now this begins the period of the divided kingdom. And so we're going to have 2 different nations instead of 1. And yet God would have blessed both of them had they remained faithful and committed to the covenant. But in 1 Kings 14:16, and he will give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, who sinned and made Israel to sin. The 10 northern tribes would end up going into captivity after a period of about 205 years. Why? What happened? As soon as Rehoboam came to the throne, Jeroboam, he determined that he was worried that his people in Israel would go down to Jerusalem to worship, and then they would, one by one, they would begin to leave him, and they would flock to Jerusalem. And so what he determined to do to keep them from going down there to offer sacrifice in the temple and to do the yearly feast, he built two pagan gods and 2 altars to the pagan gods, and he put one in Dan and one in Bethel. They were at both ends of his providence. They were over his kingdom. And so he made it very convenient for them. And he said, you don't have to go down to Jerusalem, that's too far for you. You go and worship the gods in Dan and in Bethel. And so they began to follow pagan idolatry. And this followed every king in the north. Every king in the north followed that pattern of idolatry. And so finally, after a little over 200 years, God had had enough, and then he destroyed them and punished them by putting them into Assyrian captivity in 722 BC. And so in 722 BC, they go into captivity, and now we just have Judah alone. But we see Judah alone, that 135 years later, they repeat the same mistake that Israel made, and then God would punish them, and so they would be punished in captivity, beginning in 605 would be the first raid into the land of Jerusalem, and then there would be another one in 597, and finally, in 586, they would besiege Jerusalem. It would be destroyed, the temple would be stripped, it would be burnt to the ground, the gates of the city and the walls of the city would be destroyed, and all of it burned with fire, and it would be nothing but rubble. And then they would go into Babylonian captivity, and there they would remain for 70 years. Jeremiah prophesied that, yes, God is going to punish them. They're going to be in Babylonian captivity, but they're going to be able to come out after a period of 70 years. And so now both kingdoms are in captivity because of their disobedience to God. And so the nation of Israel that once had just a promising beginning has had a terrible ending. First, Assyrian captivity, 722 BC, and then Babylonian captivity in 586 BC. Well, as God promised, he brought them out of captivity. At the end of 70 years, they were allowed to come back. They were allowed to come back in 3 different ways, beginning with Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. They were given the option. They could go back to Jerusalem, or they could remain in the land where they were. And so they were given the right in order to return if that's what they chose to do. And so many of them determined to stay where they were because they have their homes there and families there. But there were a good number that decided to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the city. And then Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and his mother and his servants his princes and his officers went out to the king of Babylon, and the king of Babylon in the 8th year of his reign took him prisoner. Again, this is pointing to Judah's captivity. Now, God promised that they would come out, and Ezra, who led one of the people out, said now in the 2nd month of the 2nd year they're coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, Jeshu the son of Zodadak, and the rest of their brethren, the priests, and the Levites. And all those who had come out of captivity to Jerusalem began to work and appointed the Levites from 20 years old and above to oversee the work of the house of the Lord. And so they're allowed to come back to captivity. They're allowed to come back and be able to rebuild. And so there are many problems, but finally they do get the temple. They lay the foundation, and then it lays dormant for 16 years. And Ezra and Haggai will go in there and chastise them and encourage them to get it built. And so 4 years later, after they'd been in the land 20 years, they finished the temple. Nehemiah goes with the contingency, and he's able to rebuild the walls and the gates of the city in 52 days. And so they begin their rebuilding. And so now they're back in Jerusalem. But again, it wasn't like it was before. It was just a remnant. It was just a small part of what they were. And so the older ones were very discouraged, and they cried when they saw the new temple because it lacked the splendor and the majesty of the one that was built by Solomon. But God wanted them to go back and to rebuild, to see if they would follow him, if they learned anything while in captivity, but also to prepare the way for the coming of the real temple that was going to be built in the time of Christ. The last thing we want to look at today is to remind you that when the tabernacle was dedicated and when the temple was dedicated in the days of Solomon, there was a great feast of dedication, and there was a great example of God taking presence up in those facilities by the cloud overshadowing the tabernacle and the temple in order to demonstrate that God's presence of dwelling with them in a symbolic way. When the new temple is built after captivity in the remnant, that never takes place. God never takes residence up in that new temple because that was not going to be his permanent dwelling place. And so that's where we'll end